Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of Father Brown Catches the Killer, a fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of G.K. Chesterton's legendary detective. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from, share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. Your keen eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. Father Brown Hunts the Unseen. The corpse was still warm, yet his autopsy revealed he had died 2 days ago. It began on a morning cloaked in mist, the kind that seems to carry whispers of things not yet spoken. At 6:04 a.m., Mrs. Edith Lanchester, the parish's most punctual and pious soul, arrived to arrange the altar flowers as she always did. But on this particular morning, the scent of lilies was overwhelmed by something far colder. A body slumped beneath the old ash tree beside the chapel. At first she assumed he was a drunkard, or perhaps one of the displaced poor seeking refuge. But as she stepped closer, the glint of a crucifix caught her eye. Blood had pooled beneath him, smeared into the grass like a forgotten prayer. But it wasn't the blood that made her scream. It was the message scratched into the dirt with a shaking finger. Venit tenebrae. Darkness has come. The local police arrived, swiftly, routine in their initial investigation. They didn't flinch when they discovered the man was Edward Silas Grange, a name familiar only for his disdain toward the church and his skeptical editorials in the village paper. But when the coroner ran his name through the system, everyone fell silent. Edward Grange had died 2 days earlier in a car crash just outside Cheltenham. His body had been examined, autopsied, and buried in his family vault. There were witnesses, a service, mourning, a coffin lowered into the earth. And yet, here he was, dead again. It wasn't the kind of case the police liked to admit to, so they chalked it up to mistaken identity or grave robbery, suggesting perhaps the body from the vault had been stolen and staged. But Father Brown knew better. He had officiated Grange's funeral himself. He had seen the man's face, pale and still, beneath the coffin's glass panel. He had read the last rites. There was no mistake. So how, then, could the same man die twice? That night, Father Brown stood in his small study, a cup of cold tea forgotten beside him, staring at the photographs taken at the crime scene. He wasn't looking at the body. He was looking at the crucifix, the one clenched in the dead man's hand. It was his. Not a replica, not similar in shape. His, the very one missing from the chapel's altar that same week. And then there was the ring, an old worn band with a barely legible inscription on the inside. 13th March, First Confession. A date Father Brown had never recorded. A confession he never heard. A sin unspoken, yet bound to him. The next morning, Father Brown traveled to Grange's home. The house was still sealed, untouched since his death. The air inside smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic. On a hunch, he examined the brickwork in the study fireplace and found a hollow pocket behind a loose stone. Inside, a leather-bound journal, cracked with age and stained with something that looked like rust. But it wasn't a diary. It was a record of secrets, page after page of confessions, detailed, intimate, chilling. But none of them belonged to Grange. They belonged to others, people from the village, people still alive. There was an entry about the choir boy and the vicar from 1939, a scandal buried for decades. Another entry described Mrs. Fairmont's tea, always poured from the same cup, always with a few extra drops of something bitter. Another page, dated long before the events occurred, read, Father Brown knows. He pretends not to, but he knows. The handwriting was erratic, but consistent throughout. The dates, some from the past, some from years not yet come. And then, without warning, the journal ended. The last page blank, save for a faint fingerprint smudge, and the words, He sees me now. Over the next few nights, the church began to shift. Not physically, but atmospherically. Cold air hung in places where warmth should linger. Candles refused to light. Shadows moved where there was no light to cast. Them. And always, always, there was the whisper. It came in the confessional, during the silence of night. Sometimes it spoke Latin. Sometimes it said nothing at all. But it always ended the same way, with a quiet laugh. Not human, not mocking, but familiar. And worst of all, it spoke Father Brown's name. One evening, a letter arrived from the bishop. No envelope, no signature, just a single slip of paper typed with urgency. Do not pursue this. It knows you're watching. That same night, Father Brown found a photograph on the rectory doorstep. In it, he was sleeping in his chair, eyes closed, mouth slightly open. A peaceful image, except the timestamp read 3 hours before he had gone to bed. On the back, scribbled in near illegible ink, were 5 words that tightened around his heart like a noose. You were not alone, Father. What began as a question of death had become something far more disturbing, something theological, something spiritual, something perhaps older than either. Father Brown returned to the morgue in defiance of the bishop's warning. He needed to look at the body again, but it wasn't the corpse that unsettled him this time. It was the mirror in the viewing room. Because in that reflection, the body wasn't lying still. It was sitting up, smiling. He turned instantly. Nothing. The corpse was still, pale, lifeless, but the mirror showed something else. Grange standing, staring, and mouthing something. A name. Father Brown's name. At this point, reason began to betray him. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't pray. Even his rosary beads felt cold in his hands. The world was no longer what it had been. And then came the final insult. The church Bible, heavy with incense and history, flipped open on its own during Mass. No wind, no hands. It landed on the book of Job. And in the margin beside the verse, "Have you considered my servant Job?" Someone had written, "I am the God you forgot, and I never left." The next morning, Father Brown shut the church, locked the doors. No morning Mass, no confession, no funerals. He sat alone in his office, the curtains drawn, his hands resting on the photograph of himself sleeping, not shaking, not afraid, just silent, as though carrying a truth too heavy for words. "I know who did it," he whispered finally, "but the truth will never be told." Outside, the rain began to fall again. The wind howled softly through the trees, and at exactly midnight, the church bell rang. Not once, not twice, but 12 times. No one pulled the rope, and from somewhere deep within the church's stone belly, a whisper echoed, too soft to place, too cold to forget. You are not watching this alone. Chapter 2, Secrets Buried Beneath Church Grounds. They dug up the wrong coffin, and inside wasn't a body, but a handwritten letter from someone who hadn't been born yet. It began, as most darkness does, in silence. A silence so deep it hummed like static behind the ears. The grave had been disturbed overnight, its soil loose and damp as though unearthed by something not quite human. It wasn't vandalism. The headstone was intact, the brass plate gleaming, polished even. No prints, no signs of trespass. But the caretaker, old Mr. Withers, knew something was wrong the moment he stepped onto the church grounds that morning. He said the earth felt too soft, like it was still breathing. The grave in question belonged to Sister Miriam Elwood, a nun who had died decades ago under quiet circumstances. No scandal, no suspicion, just a name fading gently into the parish records. Her stone was simple, her files sparse. But when the groundskeeper leaned on his spade and pushed the tip of it into the soil, it slid too easily, as if the ground wanted to be opened, as if something underneath needed to be found. Father Brown arrived not long after. He hadn't been informed by the diocese, nor summoned by the caretaker. He simply felt it. Something pulling him back to the churchyard, as though the land itself had spoken. With a nod from Withers, they began to dig. The smell hit them first. Not decay, but ink. Old ink. Musty. Sharp. Like the kind used in parchment from centuries past. And then, after 6 feet and 3 prayers whispered under breath, the spade hit wood. But it wasn't a coffin. Not exactly. It was smaller, older, unmarked, bound with iron hinges that seemed newer than the rest of the box. They opened it, expecting bones. But what they found inside defied every expectation. Neatly arranged were dozens of letters, each sealed with black wax, bearing no names, only dates, all of them dated decades into the future. And at the very top, sitting alone on yellowed paper, one letter unsealed. Inside, a message written in elegant, precise handwriting: "You must stop what has begun." The first body was not the first. The last will not be the last. M.E. Father Brown stared at the initials. M.E. Miriam Elwood. The very nun they believed they'd just dug up. But her body wasn't there. Only this letter. Only ink, paper, and impossibility. There was no explanation, no logic, no science that could hold it. Father Brown didn't even speak at first. He simply stood in the grave, eyes locked on the open box, as if waiting for something more to surface, another clue, another impossibility, maybe even a sign from God himself. But nothing came. Just the wind shifting slightly, and the faint echo of distant bells that hadn't rung in years. Back in the rectory, Father Brown laid the letters out across the old wooden table. With trembling hands, he opened one. Dated May 3rd, 2028. 5 years into the future. Inside, another message. The sins you think buried are not. They walk. They remember. One wears a collar. No signature, no explanation. The next letter, dated a year further, was worse, more frantic, more unhinged. The church floorboards know. The bell tower watches. Don't go beneath the vestry. The bones aren't hers. That night, Father Brown didn't sleep. He sat beside the altar, praying, sweating, waiting for dawn. The shadows in the chapel seemed longer than usual, curling toward him like reaching hands. He heard footsteps in the balcony, though no one was there. He heard the confessional door creak open, though no one had entered. Then, from behind the altar, came a sound he would never forget. A scratch, slow, deliberate, as though someone or something was clawing beneath the stone. Not urgently, patiently. Father Brown retrieved the old blueprints from the church archives the next morning. Maps of the crypt, the tunnels, the foundations. But what he found shouldn't have been there. A sealed sub-level, marked only by an inked X, with no stairs and no door. A chamber beneath the altar itself, a place that did not exist until now. He consulted no one. He waited until midnight, candle in hand, descended into the crypt alone. Dust choked the air. Time seemed slower. He reached the wall beneath the altar, stone cold, smooth, until he pressed his hand to it and felt it give way. The wall moved. Behind it, darkness deeper than any he'd felt before. A room, a chamber, a forgotten place with no air and no sound. Inside the chamber was a bed, a nun's habit, neatly folded, and on the bed, a skeleton, headless. Father Brown staggered back, bile rising in his throat. This wasn't Sister Miriam, or was it? The grave above was empty. The coffin held letters, but here was death. Raw, unnamed, lost. He lit the candle higher. On the stone wall behind the skeleton, carved deeply, was a single sentence. You buried the wrong one. He emerged from the crypt in silence, face pale, eyes darker than the candle's flame. He said nothing, not to Withers, not to the bishop, not even to himself, because something had changed, something old had woken. The next morning, a visitor arrived, a woman, maybe 50, dressed plainly, hands trembling. She said nothing at first, simply handed Father Brown a photo. A child's drawing, really. Crude, crayon sketched, of a nun, a headless nun, standing beside the church. In the drawing, the nun's habit was stained red. Her arms pointed toward the ground. My daughter drew this yesterday, the woman said. She's 6. She's never been here. Father Brown took the drawing, barely able to breathe, because the drawing showed something else, something in the dirt beneath the nun's feet. A door. That night, he returned again to the chamber, not to pray, not to investigate, but to listen. And he heard it again. The scratching. Only this time, it wasn't beneath him. It was above, from inside the confessional. He ran back up the stone steps, heart pounding, candle flickering. The church was empty, or so he thought. The confessional door, open just an inch, swung wider by the breeze. But there was no breeze. Inside, on the bench, sat another letter, dated tomorrow, just 4 words, she will rise tonight. That was the first night Father Brown locked the church from the inside, and no one saw him until morning. The townspeople say they heard the organ play that night, though no one touched the keys. Others say they saw a figure walking along the churchyard wall. A woman, in black, her head tilted at an impossible angle. Some say she smiled. Father Brown never confirmed it. But when dawn came and the locks were opened, he stepped out with something in his eyes no one had seen before. Terror, not fear, not dread, but the unmistakable, bone-deep terror of a man who had looked into something he was never meant to see. He gathered the letters, placed them in a satchel, and buried them beneath the church floor, in the chamber where the bones had been. Then he sealed it, permanently, or so he believed, because 2 days later, a child digging near the church for wildflowers found another box, smaller, newer, not wood, stone. Inside, another letter, with today's date. It read, "You were warned." Father Brown now walks with a limp. No one knows why. He no longer preaches on Sundays. He simply sits in the last pew, eyes closed, whispering prayers in a language no one recognizes. When asked about the grave, he says only this: I know who she is. I know what's beneath this church, but the truth will never be told. And somewhere beneath the altar, sealed behind ancient stone and forgotten blueprints, something scratches. Still. Chapter 3. A confession. Too late found. He confessed to a murder that hadn't happened yet, and when it finally did, The victim had already named their killer, years before they died. The church was empty when Father Brown entered that morning, but the scent of burnt incense still hung in the air, dense and clinging. He paused, instinct tightening in his chest. Something wasn't right. Not the silence, it was louder. Not the air, it was heavier. The confessional door was ajar. That, in itself, wasn't strange. But the candle beside it was lit, and no one had been inside since midnight. He approached slowly, every step making the floor beneath him creak like an old man's breath. The curtain inside was pulled shut. He opened it. There was no one inside, only a single envelope, yellowed, unmarked, and inside a torn page from a journal. One line only. I have taken a life that has not yet been lost, and now I wait for justice that will never come. It was unsigned. No date, no context. But in Father Brown's bones, he felt something click, the sound of a sin, catching up to its time. The mystery began before the murder, and that, perhaps, is what made it unbearable to understand. A man named Ellis Winthrop had walked into the church 6 months earlier, eyes red with tears, face gaunt, heart clearly burdened by something deeper than shame. He had asked to confess, but not in the usual place. He refused the booth. Instead, he begged to speak in the sanctuary, beneath the crucifix. I want God to watch me this time, he'd said. The confession was peculiar, disjointed. He never named names. He only said this: she won't die yet, not for a while, but when she does, it will be my fault, and no one will believe it, least of all me. Father Brown, used to riddles from those on the edge of spiritual collapse, pressed gently. Was he talking about a wife, a daughter, a stranger? Ellis only smiled, but it wasn't a peaceful one. It was the smile of someone halfway into madness, or prophecy. She'll write the name in blood, he whispered. Mine, and I won't be anywhere near her when it happens. Then he left. No absolution, no blessing, no contact since, until now. Now a woman named June Carter was found dead in her home. Cause of death? Poisoning. No sign of forced entry, no witnesses, but one strange detail the police couldn't explain. Her hand, outstretched toward the kitchen tiles, fingers stained red from a shattered wine glass. The blood had pooled, then smudged, then dried into a single word. Ellis. It didn't make sense. Ellis Winthrop had moved to another county. No motive, no link to the victim, no evidence he'd been near her for years. And yet, she named him with her dying breath, and her death echoed the very lines he had uttered 6 months earlier. Father Brown was called in unofficially, a favor. The local inspector didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in Brown's ability to see through the fog. Yet this time, the fog felt impenetrable. Digging into June Carter's life revealed nothing remarkable. A retired schoolteacher, no enemies, quiet, alone. But one detail stood out. Her diaries, meticulously kept for nearly 30 years, were missing, torn from her bookshelf, removed, all except one. Hidden in the back of her wardrobe, Father Brown found a single page tucked beneath a floorboard. The date, 2002, 21 years earlier. It read, Ellis Winthrop scares me. He watches me when I leave the choir. I think he knows I know. Knows what? Father Brown's thoughts began to spiral. The confessional note, the blood, the diary, a man who claimed to have killed before the act, a woman who seemed to know he would. The pieces didn't fit. They contradicted time, motive, logic. But the moment that nearly made him stop, the moment that rattled even the foundation of his faith, was what he found next. The original confession? The torn page in the confessional booth? It wasn't new. It was dated, watermarked by the paper manufacturer, printed in 1997. How could a note written 26 years ago describe a murder that hadn't happened until now? Unless someone knew it would happen. Unless this had all been planned long ago. Not as an act of vengeance, but of prophecy. A puzzle built with time as its weapon. Father Brown took the note, the diary page, and his fears to the bishop. The bishop refused to speak. Instead, he handed Father Brown a file. It was old, sealed, dusty. The file was labeled Ellis Winthrop. Clerical transfer denied. 1996. Inside, records of disciplinary hearings, strange behavior, obsessive writings, and, buried deep, a warning letter from a nun named Sister Miriam Elwood. "He sees what isn't yet real," she wrote, "and sometimes I fear he brings it with him." That name again. Miriam Elwood, the nun whose body had never been found. The name behind the letters, buried under the church in chapter 2. The same initials that appeared in the future dated letter beneath the grave. It was all connected. Somehow. Father Brown felt the ground shifting beneath him, like something had been buried, not a secret, but a timeline, a design, a plan unfolding across years through whispers, prayers, and confessions. And then came the photograph, slid beneath the chapel door in the middle of the night. A picture of Father Brown, sitting across from Ellis Winthrop. The problem? That conversation had never happened. He'd never met with Ellis outside the sanctuary. And yet the photo showed them, together, seated at the town's old tea shop. Same table, same window, dated 3 weeks in the future. Written on the back, "Don't let him speak again." Father Brown sat in his study, surrounded by evidence of things that should not exist. A name written in blood before the crime, a confession older than the death, a prophecy of fear, and now a photo of the future. He began to wonder, was he a priest or a pawn? And what game had he been placed into? He returned to June Carter's home. It had been cleared, boxed up, cleaned for sale. But the tiles were still stained. And there, in the creases of the grout, something else emerged under UV light. Another word. Fainter. Confession. Ellis didn't just know it would happen. He knew why, but the reason had never been spoken. Because the true confession had never been made. Until now. Behind a loose panel in the back of June's hallway closet, Father Brown found a cassette tape. An old dictaphone recording, labeled only to be played after my death. He didn't listen to it in the house. He took it back to the church, slid it into the old player, pressed play. At first, static, then breathing, then a voice, June Carter's. But she wasn't afraid. She was calm, cold. "If you're hearing this, I've died the way I always expected. And if Ellis is still alive, he hasn't finished what he started. He killed someone once before. Not with poison, not with a knife, with a lie. And he buried the truth beneath a collar. He confessed to you, Father, but not everything, not the part that matters. Because what he did to me wasn't murder. It was worse. Silence. Then one final line. He took my confession, and then he buried it, because the truth was about you." The tape clicked off. Father Brown sat in silence for a long time. What truth? Why had Ellis buried her confession? Was it protection? Was it fear? Or was it guilt? The next morning, Father Brown received a letter. No return address. Inside, a single sentence. "I know who did it. But the truth will never be told, and on the back of the letter, a fingerprint, his own. Chapter 4. The Vicar's Sinister Midnight Visitor. The vicar's body was found nailed to the inside of his own front door, but there were no signs of forced entry, and every lock was still bolted from the inside. It was a Tuesday when it happened, rain-soaked, moonless, and so silent that the town dogs didn't bark. No footsteps, no screams, just the sound of distant thunder. And then, sometime between midnight and 3 a.m., a single candle lit itself in the rectory window. That's what the milkman said. That's what started it all. Vicar Thomas Wellings had been in the village of Elmridge for over 20 years. Quiet, polite, respected. Never scandal, never suspicion. The kind of man who left every door open and every conversation unfinished, as though the world were too polite for finalities. But when the church bell tolled 7 times at midnight, without anyone pulling the rope, people began to ask questions, and when no one saw the vicar at morning prayer, they sent for Father Brown. What he found inside the rectory was not just death, it was a message. The front door had been locked from within. 3 separate bolts, all in place. No broken glass, no tampering. But when they forced their way in, they found the vicar's body pinned to the wood, hands stretched wide, palms bloodied, eyes open, mouth twisted into something between horror and awe. His chest had been carved with the word absconditum, Latin meaning hidden. The strangest thing? He was smiling. Father Brown stood at the threshold, the scent of burnt wax and old parchment clinging to the air like guilt. Something was deeply wrong, not just in the crime, but in its silence. There was no struggle, no noise, no signs of panic, and the candle the milkman saw, still flickering beside the body, untouched by wind or time. There were no fingerprints, no footprints, only one thing out of place. The vicar's Bible had been opened to the book of Ezekiel, chapter 8, the vision of abominations, and someone had underlined one verse in deep red ink. And he brought me to the door of the court, and when I looked, behold, a hole in the wall. That night, Father Brown didn't sleep, not because of fear, but because he had remembered something he'd heard years ago in a whispered confession long forgotten. If he ever opens that door, he won't be the same. The next day, the pathologist confirmed the impossible. The vicar had died from shock, heart failure, but his body had been positioned. Afterward, whoever or whatever did this didn't kill him. They only made sure he would be found like that. But by who and why? The church records yielded nothing. His last sermon, however, was telling, titled The Things We Bury, a cryptic homily about hidden sins, sacred silence, and the noise beneath the church floor. That phrase echoed in Father Brown's mind. He returned to the rectory after dark, alone, candles in hand. He examined the floor beneath the vicar's study and found the old rug, slightly uneven. Beneath it, wood warped by dampness and heat, and beneath that, a trapdoor. He hesitated, then opened it. A narrow ladder descended into blackness. Not a cellar, not a wine room, but a tunnel, earth walls, wet air, and along the walls, symbols, carved deep, old Latin, older than the vicar, symbols of warding, binding, and then footsteps, but not behind him, below. He followed them, deeper into the passage until he reached a door, heavy, iron, locked, but not from this side. The lock was turned inward, as if whatever was inside was never meant to get out. Father Brown leaned close and heard breathing, software, rhythmic, like prayer. He backed away slowly, sealed the door again, returned to the study. But when he closed the trap door, the candle in the vicar's room flickered out on its own. That night, another letter arrived, slipped beneath the chapel door. No handwriting, just printed words. Do not open what he died to keep shut. But that wasn't the worst part. Enclosed, with the note, was a photograph, an old one, from decades ago, of a much younger Vicar Wellings, standing beside a boy. That boy was Father Brown. And in the background, behind them both, was the same iron door, already open. The next morning, the police reported a second incident. A local parishioner had vanished. A woman named Alice Drew. Her last known location, the chapel. Her car was still there, her phone was on the pew, and inside the confessional, a single red ribbon, the kind she always wore in her hair. Father Brown searched for hours. The church, the grounds, the tunnel. Nothing. Until he found her voice, not in person, but on tape. An old recorder was sitting in the lectern. Pressed play. Alice's voice. He came through the door. Not walked, drifted, like smoke in a mirror. He didn't speak. He didn't breathe. But I knew it was him, the one the vicar feared. He pointed to the confessional. I sat. He listened, but he never asked for forgiveness, only silence. Then he said, "Tell him I'm back, and this time he's the one who has to confess." Then silence. Tape ends. Father Brown returned to the confessional. This time there was someone inside. Back turned. Still. When the curtain was drawn, the figure slowly stood and turned, wearing the vicar's robes. But it wasn't the vicar. It was someone with no face, only skin, stretched tight, smooth, empty. And when it leaned forward, its voice came like wind through stone. You buried me in prayer. But the earth never forgets. And then it vanished, just vanished. Father Brown fell to his knees, not in fear, but in clarity. This was never about murder. This was about return. Vicar Wellings had opened something years ago, something never meant to be seen. And now, it had come home. That night, Father Brown opened the iron door. Inside was a room, empty, save for one item, a mirror, facing the wall. He turned it slowly and saw himself, but older, worn, and behind the reflection, a figure, smiling, not yet real, but coming. He whispered, "I know who you are." And the reflection whispered back, "Then why did you open the door?" Chapter 5. Bloodstained Bible reveals the killer. The Bible was soaked in blood, but the fingerprints on the pages belonged to a man who had been dead for 50 years. And the verse, marked in red, named the killer by their full baptismal name. The church was locked when they found it, not with a key, but from the inside. No windows were broken, no alarms triggered. The only sound heard the night before was the faint echo of a hymn no one had sung in decades. When the parish secretary arrived, the next morning she had to call the locksmith. She thought it was just a jammed door, but what waited behind it was something far colder. Father Brown was already there, called from the rectory by a strange, gut-deep unease. He couldn't explain why, only that he'd woken at 3:33 a.m. with the overwhelming certainty that something sacred had been violated. Something not merely criminal, but cosmic. Inside the church, nothing was out of place, except for one thing. A single Bible had been placed on the altar, not opened, not positioned for reading, slumped, like someone had thrown it there with force. The front cover was torn, and it was drenched. Blood, not just splattered, soaked, dripping down the edge of the table, pooling into the cloth, but the Bible hadn't been there during evening mass. Someone, or something, had brought it back in the dead of night, and inside it, a horror that turned even Father Brown's blood cold. Between the pages of Revelation and Matthew, written in deep red, so red it hadn't dried, was a name, not handwritten, printed, pressed by ink and flesh. Clarissa Margaret Hale, the town librarian, a woman in her 70s, revered, alone, and as of that morning, found dead in her home, a crucifix rammed down her throat. The Bible had predicted it, but worse. The fingerprints on the Bible didn't belong to Clarissa, or Father Brown, or anyone still living. They belonged to Jonathan Hale, her father, a man who had died in 1973. Father Brown's hands trembled when he held the Bible, not from fear, from recognition, because he'd seen this book before. In 1994, a boy had confessed something, a child, 7 years old, scared. Father Brown remembered every word. I found the book where the red writing glows. But the name wasn't mine. It was hers. It said she'd be dead, but she wasn't. Yet. At the time, he'd assumed it was nonsense, childhood fantasy. But now, 30 years later, the name had come true. The blood had returned, and the Bible was back. But whose hands had held it? And what did it mean? The pages beneath the name, Clarissa Margaret Hale, were stuck together. Gently, Father Brown separated them. There was more. A verse circled in red. Revelation 20:12. And the dead were judged out of those things which were written in the books according to their works. And beneath it, faint but visible, a fingerprint, unlike any he'd seen before. The ridges were reversed, as though the print had been left by the inside of a hand. He took it to forensics. They returned the scan with a note. This print belongs to no known human pattern. Ridges inverted. Density unnatural. Possibly artificial or pre-human. Father Brown didn't sleep that night. Instead, he went to Clarissa Hale's house. The police had cleared the scene, but he had a key. She'd once given it to him with a laugh. In case the devil visits, and I'm not strong enough to keep him out. He walked through the cold, empty rooms, everything untouched, tea still in the pot, crossword, half filled, curtains drawn, but one thing stood out, a single chair turned to face the fireplace. Not odd in itself, except Clarissa had always said she hated the fire. Too much like hell, she'd said. I like my warmth from the sun. So why was the chair turned to face the hearth? Inside the fireplace, beneath the grate, Father Brown found a stack of torn pages, from old prayer books, psalms, confessions, psalters, all blackened, and one page left untouched, a baptismal certificate for Clarissa Margaret Hale. But the ink was smudged in the section for godparents. Written over and over again was the name Jonathan, 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 Jonathan. He had been dead 50 years. Why was his name repeated? Why had she burned the other pages? And why now had she died exactly as described by a Bible soaked in blood that hadn't yet dried? Back at the rectory, Father Brown spread out the evidence. One Bible, one name, one verse, and one impossible fingerprint. But then he noticed something else. A pattern in the pages themselves, every 10th page, torn slightly at the top, every 7th chapter, underlined. A code. He followed the marks. They spelled a sentence. The book names the next. Next? Another name? He flipped frantically through the rest of the Bible, every page, every margin, until he reached the back cover. Tucked inside was a slip of paper, a church bulletin from 1963. A date circled in black, August 4th, a baptism. Father Brown searched the registry. 1. Name Samuel Joseph Croft, the current police chief, still alive, still investigating Clarissa's death, and, unknown to him, the next name written in blood. Father Brown rushed to the police station, demanded to see Croft. He wasn't there, hadn't come in that morning. His wife hadn't seen him since he left for work the night before. He never arrived. His car was found an hour later, doors locked, keys still inside. The only thing missing? His Bible, the one he kept in his glove compartment. Back, in the church, Father Brown lit a candle, sat in the dark, waited, and just after midnight, he heard it, the sound of pages turning, slow, heavy, as if by unseen hands. He rose, walked to the altar. The bloodstained Bible was gone. In its place, another, clean, white, new, except for one detail. The back cover was cracked. Inside, a slip of paper, with his own name on it. Brown Francis, born July 12th, baptized at St. Jude's. No blood, yet, just a circle around one verse. Matthew 10:26, for there is nothing hidden that will not be revealed. And beside it, the mark, the inverted fingerprint, the one not born of any living human. Father Brown whispered, barely audible, I know who did it, but the truth will never be told. Chapter 6. The corpse whispered a name. The morgue recorder played back a single word, but none of the pathologists had spoken, and the voice belonged to the dead man lying on the table. It began, as these things always seem to, with silence that wasn't quite silence. The air inside the county morgue buzzed faintly, an electrical hum, almost imperceptible, but sharp enough to sting the senses. Technician Laura Grimley had come in early to finish the paperwork on an overnight arrival. A routine. Stabbing. No family. No ID. Just a pale, cold body with a stitched wound down the middle and an evidence tag labeled John Doe 171. She turned on the recorder, as she always did. Standard procedure. Autopsy notes. Ambient background. Chain of custody. But before she could even say a word into the mic, the playback began. Without prompt, without cause, it played one name, one word. Brown. The voice was raspy, guttural, not mechanical, not glitched, not hers, and not from any living member of the medical staff, but the voice belonged to the corpse, the same corpse lying motionless on the table in front of her. Jaw sewn shut, vocal cords destroyed. And yet, it spoke. The audio was handed to the police. They brought in Father Brown immediately. When he listened to the tape, he didn't flinch. He didn't blink. But something behind his eyes darkened, like a light dying in a hallway of memory. Because it wasn't just the name the corpse had said. It was how he said it. Not as a question. Not as a warning, but like an accusation. The mystery began with the identity of the man. No prints, no dental records, no tags in his clothes. But his body bore an unusual scar, a circle with a slash through it, burned onto the underside of his forearm. Not a tattoo, a brand. Father Brown had seen that symbol once before, years ago, on a page torn from an excommunicated monk's journal. A list of those who see beyond death. The mark had been called Signum Expecto, the sign of the awaited. He visited the body himself, requested to be alone with it. Just 5 minutes. The moment he stepped into the autopsy room, the temperature dropped. Not a chill, a plunge. His breath frosted in front of him. The lights flickered once, then held. The body lay still, pale, unknowing, but then Its hand twitched, only once. Father Brown didn't move. He simply whispered, "I heard you." The body didn't speak again. But when Father Brown looked down at the morgue tray, there was a smudge in the condensation of the steel. A word traced by a single fingertip. Confess. Things unraveled quickly after that. The autopsy found something embedded in the man's throat. Not swallowed, not forced, planted, a piece of parchment, rolled tightly, preserved in wax. When unwrapped, it revealed a confession. But not the dead man's. It was a typed letter, signed by Bishop Alfred Morton, and dated June 12, 1975. It read, "I buried the truth because it would have destroyed the church. But I can feel the sin clawing its way back to the surface. I fear it will speak through someone who cannot be silenced. If I disappear, look for the one who dies with my name in his mouth." I only hope Father Brown never hears it. Father Brown read the letter twice, then 3 times, and finally set it down, his hands trembling in a way no one had ever seen, because Bishop Morton had vanished in 1975. No trace, no body, no closure. And now a man without a name had whispered his own from beyond the grave. But the mystery deepened when the surveillance footage was reviewed. The cameras inside the morgue captured nothing unusual until 3:03 a.m. At that moment, the screen flickered, and for 7 full seconds, the footage showed something that should have been impossible. The dead man sitting upright, eyes closed, mouth moving, saying one word, repeatedly, "Brown." Father Brown asked to see the body again, not in the morgue, but in the church. He insisted on laying the corpse inside the nave, lit only by candlelight. People protested. It wasn't holy, it wasn't right. But he didn't care, because he needed to hear something. At midnight, he sat alone, praying, whispering, waiting. And then, just before the final bell, the corpse exhaled, loud, clear, audible, not breath, not wind, but words. Not him. Then silence, and with it, a realization. The voice wasn't calling for Brown. It was protecting him. The accusation had been a misdirection. This wasn't about Father Brown's sins. It was about someone else's. The next day, an anonymous envelope arrived. Inside, one photo, black and white, old, faded. It showed 3 men, all in clerical garb. One was a young Bishop Morton. The second was Father Brown's predecessor, Father Callahan. The third was scratched out completely. But behind them, scrawled on a wall in chalk, was the same symbol that had been burned into the dead man's arm, Signum Expecto. And beneath it, in crude handwriting, "He walks even after death." A priest, dead, whispering, branded, carrying a confession from a vanished bishop, naming a living man. But for what crime? Father Brown returned to the archives, and there, buried deep in a locked drawer he'd never opened, he found a file labeled Project Karen. Inside, records of a secret ritual. Conducted in 1975, 3 clergymen, 1 witness, no bodies, no graves, just a ledger. One note stood out. Subject expired during the reading of the false confession. Body removed. Remains unidentified. Project terminated by Bishop Morton. Subject expired. No name, but the scar matched. The dates aligned, and the whisper wasn't just a voice, it was a resurrection. The man on the table had died decades ago, during something no one was supposed to know about. And now, for reasons unknown, he had come back, not to accuse, but to warn. Father Brown called the diocese. They denied everything, said Project Karen didn't exist, said Bishop Morton had never authored a letter, but then they said something chilling. "You were never meant to see that body." And the line went dead. That night, Father Brown found the church doors unlocked. Not broken, not forced, just open. Inside, the altar Bible had been turned to John 11, the story of Lazarus. And in the margin, one sentence. He rose, but not as he was. And beside it, written in blood, "One more will speak." The body disappeared from the morgue the next morning. No signs of struggle, no prints, no leads, but in its place, a new corpse. Same age, same scar, same voice. And when they pressed play on the recorder, it whispered a new name. Yours. Chapter 7. Justice hangs by a thread. The judge was found hanging in his chambers, but the rope wasn't tied to anything, and the floor beneath him was still covered in dust. They said it was suicide. That's how they explained it. That's how they filed it. But those who saw the body, really saw it, knew something else was at play. There was no chair kicked over, no sign of struggle, just the lifeless form of Judge Malcolm Gray, suspended mid-air like a marionette without strings, eyes open, mouth slightly parted, as though he'd died mid-sentence. The rope had no anchor. It disappeared into the ceiling and into nothing. A smooth plaster surface above him, untouched, unbroken, sealed by time and silence. And carved into the wall behind his desk, in a script no one recognized, was a phrase no one could explain. The gavel cannot silence ghosts. Father Brown was called in quietly, unofficially. The bishop wanted nothing to do with it, not after the previous cases. Too much attention, he'd warned. Let the police handle it. But Father Brown knew better. He'd seen too much already. Things that couldn't be confined by logic or time or even death. Things that looped and watched and whispered names through sealed lips. The moment he entered Judge Gray's chambers, he knew this was no suicide. The air felt wrong. Still, yet expectant. The curtains didn't sway. The clock on the wall had stopped at 3:14 a.m. But the strange part, it wasn't broken. It refused to tick, as if something had frozen the moment of death. On the judge's desk lay a sealed envelope. No name, no stamp, no dust. Father Brown opened it. Inside, one sentence. Justice will fall by thread, and the liar will drop last. There was no signature, but folded beneath the note, a photo, a courtroom, old, blurred, and seated at the bench, Judge Malcolm Gray, much younger, standing before him, a defendant, with their face scratched out entirely. But Father Brown noticed something else, something that sent a cold pulse down his spine. In the gallery, seated in the back row, was himself, older, tired, watching. Except this photo was decades old. The mystery began with a sealed trial, a case from 1989. No public record, no press, not even a docket number. But there had been a trial, one no one ever spoke of, one that had supposedly been erased. And yet, the court transcript existed. Father Brown found it buried in the judge's personal files. The defendant's name had been redacted, every page crossed out, blacked with ink so dense it tore the paper. But one line remained legible, uncrossed, as though intentionally preserved. He lies as if the rope has already broken. That same night, the courthouse janitor vanished. The CCTV footage showed him entering Judge Gray's chambers around midnight, but he never came out. The security guards swore he saw him exit the building 2 hours later, except when he checked the logs, there was no scan. And the cameras outside, only static. At 3:14 a.m., the exact moment the judge died, Father Brown returned to the chamber and found something the police had missed: a thread, thin, red, hanging from the ceiling above, where the judge had died. He climbed a ladder and reached for it. It didn't budge, it didn't stretch. It felt like steel wire, dressed in silk. And when he looked closely, too closely, he saw that the thread wasn't coming from the ceiling. It was coming through it, as if threaded into the very fabric of the room itself, as if something had sewn its way through reality. He followed the thread, literally, from the ceiling to the wall, across the floor, and through a hidden panel in the back of the judge's bookshelf. Behind it, another room, sealed for years, a private archive. Inside, hundreds of case files, all stamped exonerated, all bearing the same initials, MG, Judge Malcolm Gray. But one file sat apart, its tab torn, its folder stained. Inside, a confession, typed, dated 1989, signed Alfred Morton, the same bishop who had vanished decades ago. The same man tied to multiple buried secrets, unsolved deaths, and the symbol of the signum expecto. The confession began with 5 chilling words. I sentenced the wrong man. Father Brown read on, each line cut deeper. Morton had confessed to falsely accusing an innocent man, framing him in court, under oath, before God and witnesses. Judge Gray had presided. The sentence had been death. But the man hadn't died. Not then. He'd vanished, disappeared from the system. No grave, no record, just a final note in the file. Let the rope hold until truth breaks it. Father Brown staggered back from the file. His hands shook. His mouth went dry. The man Judge Gray had condemned was not only innocent, but never executed. So who had he become? Where had he gone? And more importantly, was he back? The thread, thin, red, unbreakable, seemed to pulse now, as if alive, as if watching. Father Brown reached again for the thread. This time, it moved, gently, pulled upward like it was being lifted, like something above was pulling it tighter. Then came the voice, software, distant, not in the room, but behind it. You saw me fall, but you never tried to catch me. The voice echoed through the walls. It wasn't Judge Gray's, it wasn't Father Brown's, it was someone else, someone who remembered. That night, the second judge died, in another city. Same conditions, same hour, same message carved into the wall. The rope remembers. And inside his office, another red thread, leading out the window, dangling into the wind, unattached to anything, yet pulling, tightening. The next morning, a final envelope arrived for Father Brown, delivered by hand. Inside, a court summons, no return address, no location, only a date. Tomorrow, 3:14 a.m., and the charge, obstruction of justice, in the eyes of the forgotten. Father Brown sat in silence and whispered, I know who did it, but the truth will never be told. Chapter 8. Murderer hides among the faithful. During communion, every chalice held wine, except one, which held blood, and the fingerprints on it belonged to a man who was already dead. It happened during the feast of St. Bartholomew, a day meant for celebration, prayer, and renewal. The pews were full, the candles were lit, and the congregation sang as one, hymns echoing through the stone bones of the church, faithful and clean. The line for communion moved slowly, reverently. No one spoke. No one expected anything but grace. And yet when Father Brown lifted the 5th chalice from the altar, he knew something was wrong. It was warmer than the rest, slick, sticky. He tilted it, and what spilled onto the linen cloth was not wine, but blood, human, still warm, still fresh. And when the police dusted for prints, they found only one set, belonging to Michael Farnham. But Michael Farnham had died 12 years ago, and not peacefully. He'd been murdered in this very village, stabbed in the hole back and left in the baptismal font. His case had never been solved, buried in silence, forgotten in the shadows of stained glass. Until now, the moment the blood hit the altar cloth, Father Brown froze. He didn't cry out, didn't flinch, but in his eyes, something ancient stirred, a recognition, not of a person, but of a pattern. He had seen this before, not the crime, but the design. The chalices had all been laid by the altar boy, Samuel, under strict guidance. 5, as always, silver, identical. And yet, somehow, one had been switched, or planted, or returned, because Father Brown remembered the detail no one else did. Michael Farnham had donated those chalices. All 5. The 5th was buried with him, laid inside his coffin, at his widow's request. So how had it returned? And why now? The mystery began in whispers. Rumors stirred among the faithful. Some said they'd seen a stranger at Mass, sitting in the back, head bowed, face unseen. Others claimed it was just the wind, or a shadow from the window. But one woman, Agnes, the florist, said she recognized him, the man in the last pew. She swore it was Michael, alive, unchanged, watching. That night, someone broke into the church. Nothing was stolen, nothing disturbed, except the baptismal font. It had been drained, scrubbed, and on the stone rim, scrawled in dark red, were 4 words: "Wash your hands, Father." Father Brown did not sleep. He went into the archives, dug through Michael Farnham's file. No autopsy photos, no crime scene reports, just one statement. Witness testimony. The last person to see him alive, Evelyn Rook, choir director, still attending Mass every Sunday, still sitting in the front row, still smiling. Father Brown visited her the next morning. Tea was served. Polite conversation, but the air was tight, uncomfortable. And when he mentioned Michael's name, she dropped her cup, not clumsily, deliberately. Her smile never faded. She said she had no regrets, that Michael had met the consequences of his choices. She offered no explanation, no grief, only a question. Why are you asking about a dead man who never really left? The next clue came from the crypt, a letter tucked behind the stone slab bearing Michael's name, written in pencil, no envelope. It read, "The faithful are not always clean. The righteous are not always silent. The dead are not always gone." There was no signature, but beneath it, etched into the stone with something sharp, was the same phrase that had appeared in blood. "Wash your hands, Father." That Sunday during Mass, Father Brown looked out into the pews and realized something terrifying. One person was sitting in a place that had been empty for years, the back left pew, where Michael always sat, and the man sitting there now was wearing the same coat Michael had worn the night he died. After the service, the man vanished. No one remembered speaking to him. No one even recalled his face. But one of the children said something odd. He didn't blink. The suspense grew unbearable. Every day, Father Brown found something else out of place. The confessional door ajar. A Bible open to verses about betrayal. The smell of blood in the sacristy with no source, until one night he found a recording, left in the church sound system. It played a single voice, gravelly, deep, broken. "I sit among them. I sing with them. I kneel with them. And I wait for him to look me in the eyes." And then the final line. "When he does, I will show him who killed me." Father Brown checked the church records, cross-referenced names, baptisms, marriages, funerals, and he saw it, a pattern. Everyone connected to Michael's death, those who had testified, gossiped, suspected, covered, or prayed, were all still alive, still in the church, still attending Mass. And every one of them had been present the day the blood-filled chalice appeared. The killer wasn't gone. The killer was still there, still kneeling, still praying, still hiding in plain sight. He checked the burial register. Michael's coffin had never been exhumed, not since the funeral. Father Brown ordered it opened. He went alone. Under candlelight, in silence, beneath the gaze of a 100-year-old crucifix, he lifted the lid. The coffin was empty, no body, only a note, written in ink that had not yet dried. I sit among the faithful. The air turned cold. The candle flickered, and from behind him, someone whispered his name. He turned. No one there. But on the floor, 5 drops of fresh blood, forming a trail, leading back into the church. He followed, step by step, down the aisle, toward the altar, and there, in place of the usual host, a 5th chalice, already filled, waiting. He didn't touch it, he just stared, because the fingerprints on the rim, faint but fresh, were his own. The next morning, Father Brown locked the doors of the church, and when asked who the killer was, he answered, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 9. Whispers in Father Brown's confessional. The man who confessed his sins to Father Brown had been buried 3 days earlier, with his lips sewn shut. It was just after midnight when it began. Rain tapped gently against the church's stained glass windows, rhythmic, almost thoughtful. The final candles were nearly burned out, casting long shadows down the stone walls of St. Mary's. Father Brown had just finished his prayers and was preparing to close the sanctuary for the night. But then the light above the confessional door flicked on by itself. That was the first sign. He paused, waited. No footsteps, no sound of the booth creaking open. But the small red lamp remained lit, glowing like a wound in the dark. Someone wanted to speak. He stepped inside, slid the screen open. Silence. Then a breath. Not a voice, just a single, slow inhale. And finally, a whisper. Not broken, not scared, but hollow, empty, as if spoken from behind a wall. I took her hand so she couldn't reach for heaven. The voice was calm, measured. But there was one problem that pierced Father Brown to the core. He recognized it. It was the voice of Thomas Lyle. But Thomas Lyle was dead, buried. A funeral held 3 days prior. Father Brown had performed the rite himself. He had seen the coffin, seen the waxy, stitched mouth of the man who had died alone in his home, his throat crushed, his mouth sewn shut, to hide the last expression of terror frozen on his face. And now that same mouth was speaking again. From inside, a sealed confessional. The mystery began the following morning. Father Brown went to the crypt, demanding the casket be exhumed. The gravedigger, uneasy but obedient, complied. The coffin was opened. The corpse was there, just as he remembered. Only now, the thread sealing the lips was gone, and the mouth was slightly open, as if it had spoken, as if it had more to say. That night, Father Brown sat alone in the chapel. He didn't pray. He didn't move. He watched the confessional. It lit up again. Same time, same glow, same silence. This time, the voice said something new. The altar is hiding what the priest refused to bury. And then faintly, like a memory folding in on itself, the last sin is yours. The next morning, the altar cloth was stained. Not wine, not oil, but ink. Thick, black, fresh. The Bible left on the lectern had a page missing. Leviticus 5, the laws of guilt, the punishment of secret sin. In its place, a folded note. She never reached. The confessional. He made sure of it. No signature, no handwriting. Just cut letters from old hymnals, glued like a ransom note from hell. Father Brown began to dig. Not through the earth this time, but through his own memory. Years ago, a girl had gone missing. Abigail Maris, 17, choir singer, bright, curious, too curious. She'd come to Father Brown the night before she disappeared, said she needed to confess something, said someone had been following her, said she knew what had happened to another girl before her, the one they'd all called an accident. But Abigail never made it into the booth. She vanished the next morning. No trace, no body, only her rosary left behind, on the steps of the confessional. For years, Father Brown had buried that guilt, not because he didn't care, but because there was no evidence, no body, no proof, only silence. Until now, he returned to the booth the following night. The light was already on. This time, the voice whispered, "She's still here, but not in the earth. She's watching you, Father. You heard her once, but you did not listen." Father Brown pressed his ear against the screen, and then something scraped on the wood, claw-like, deliberate, a sound that didn't belong in a house of God. He opened the curtain. No one was there, but on the inside of the booth wall were scratches, 6 lines, like tally marks, as if someone had been counting the nights they couldn't speak, as if Abigail had sat in that very booth, trying to confess, while something, kept her silent. The scratches were fresh. The mystery deepened. When Father Brown checked the church blueprints, there was something he had never seen before, a sealed chamber behind the confessional, bricked off, hidden, forgotten. He broke through the wall the next night. What he found inside was not just dust and stone. It was a room, tiny, claustrophobic, empty, except for a single item, a red ribbon, still tied, still bright, the kind Abigail used to wear, pinned beneath it, a fragment of confession paper. The words, "I saw what he did. He wears the cloth, but not the faith." That night, Father Brown confronted the bishop, showed him the ribbon, showed him the note. The bishop paled. He asked only one question. "Did she name him?" Father Brown shook his head. "No," he said, "but someone else did." He returned to the booth the following night. And this time, the whisper came with a name that had not been spoken aloud in 20 years. Priest, long retired, long gone, but still on the parish roster, still on the church records. Father Bellamy, the one who'd trained him, the one who'd taught him how to listen, the one who had disappeared. The same year, Abigail did. Father Brown's breath caught in his throat, because Bellamy was supposed to be in Rome, but no one had heard from him in a decade. And then, the final whisper. He never left. He's buried beneath the church, but not in a coffin. The next day, workers broke open the foundation beneath the vestry. They found a space, a cavity. Inside, 2 skeletons, one male, one female, both clothed in priest's robes, both buried without rites, and between them, a confessional screen. Father Brown stood above the open earth, looked down into that silent pit. He closed his eyes and whispered, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 10. The Devil Wore the Cross. The priest who performed the exorcism was found burned to ash, except for the crucifix fused into his chest, and it was still warm. It began with a scream that no one else heard. Midnight, St. Augustine's Chapel, buried in the fog-choked moors. The church bells didn't ring, the hounds didn't howl, but Father Brown woke up screaming. A name on his lips he hadn't spoken in over 30 years. Lucien Marlowe. Once a priest, now presumed dead. And yet, someone, wearing his exact vestments, walked into a nearby parish that very night, took confession, led Massachusetts-delivered communion, even blessed a newborn, then disappeared before sunrise. The altar boy said he smelled like sulfur. The mystery began when the bishop summoned Father Brown without warning, without context. The meeting wasn't held at the diocese. It was in a hospital, isolation wing, 3rd floor. The room had no number on the door, just a crucifix, cracked down the middle. Inside, Father James Halloway, young, devout, shaking uncontrollably, his eyes blistered, his fingernails black, his voice broken into whispers that no one could transcribe. They had found him in the bell tower, kneeling before an invisible altar, surrounded by dead birds and melted rosary beads. The only thing he could say clearly was, "The devil wears the cloth." He had performed an exorcism the night before, on a woman named Clara Devlin, and now Clara was gone. No body, no trail, just burn marks in the shape of hands scorched into the chapel floor. Father Brown returned to the site of the ritual, St. Gertrude's Church. It had been condemned for over a decade, ever since the fire, the first fire, the one that killed Lucien Marlowe, or so they thought, because someone had reopened the doors. And on the altar, where the tabernacle used to stand, now sat a single black candle, still lit, still burning, against all known laws of wax or time. And behind it, carved into the wall with something sharp, "My name is still holy." Father Brown didn't sleep for 3 nights. When he did finally rest, he dreamt of Marlowe's face, not as it was in life, but as it had been in death, or should have been. The records of his burial were wrong. The body had never been recovered. Only ashes, but the ashes were odd, too clean. No bone, no tissue, just one item found inside the urn, a crucifix, melted, bent, and fused with something unidentifiable. The forensic report was sealed by the Vatican, marked non-canonical anomaly. Father Brown traveled to Clara Devlin's home. Abandoned, cold, mirrors shattered, crosses inverted, but in the center of her kitchen table, a journal. Heron 1 entry stood out, dated the night before her exorcism. "He came in through the mirror, said he was my salvation, said he had worn this collar before, said his name was Father Lucien." And in the corner of the page, a small burn hole, perfectly circular, still warm. He flipped the page. There were no more entries, just a single drawing, a crucifix, but upside down, with horns, and underneath it, scrawled in blood-red ink, "He blesses what he damns." The story unraveled quickly after that. 3 more churches across the region reported sightings of a priest in ancient robes. Same face, same voice, same crucifix. One congregation said his homily was the most beautiful they'd ever heard. Another said they wept uncontrollably and didn't know why. But one little girl whispered something her parents didn't understand. She said, "The priest's shadow had horns." Father Brown investigated the archived footage from the oldest church. No one had touched the tape in years. When he played it, static filled the screen. until precisely 3:33 a.m. Then, clear as day, the figure of a priest stepped into frame. He wore the cross, held the book, but his eyes were black, not metaphorically, literally, a black so deep the tape glitched around it. And when he turned to the camera, the crucifix in his hands flipped, not dropped, not turned, flipped by itself. And then the footage cut to static. He was never seen again. But that church burned down 3 hours later, with everyone inside. The only object that survived, the crucifix, untouched, clean, warm. That's when Father Brown understood. This wasn't about possession. This wasn't about a haunted church. This was about infiltration, about a devil who no longer needed to hide, because now he wore the cloth, preached the word, officiated sacraments, and no one knew the difference. The final clue came from the Vatican's black archives, a single page, filed under Ecclesia Umbra, the Church of Shadow, a doctrine redacted centuries ago, a warning. Should the deceiver wear the garments of God, the church will not fall from without, but within. Father Brown returned to St. Augustine's. Alone, candle in hand, he entered the sanctuary. The candle flickered, the air dropped 10 degrees, and on the altar, he stood. Lucian, not aged, not decayed, but whole, alive, eyes black as coal, smiling, and wearing the very same cross that had survived the fire. Only now, it glowed, not with light, but with heat. Father Brown dropped to one knee, not in prayer, but in terror. Lucian stepped down the altar, voice smooth, velvet. They all came to me for absolution, and I gave them what they truly wanted. Father Brown whispered, "Why wear the cross?" Lucian laughed, "Because no one questions the one who forgives." Then silence. And then Lucian said, "I've already heard your confession, Father, and I've already absolved you, but your penance will last forever." The next morning, the altar was clean. Father Brown was found unconscious on the steps of the church, eyes open, mouth sealed, a crucifix pressed into his hand, still warm, still glowing, and in the church's ledger, where names are recorded after each Mass, a signature, in perfect Latin script, Lucien. Father Brown never spoke again, but he wrote one final note before the ink in his pen turned to ash. "I know who he is, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 11. Clues hidden in sacred hymns. The choir sang a hymn they had never rehearsed, and every line described a murder that wouldn't happen for another 7 days. It started on a Sunday, the kind of overcast, bone-cold morning that feels like time is holding its breath. The congregation filed in quietly, coats damp from the fog, breath visible in the chill. The usual pews filled. Old widows, whispering schoolchildren, those faithful not because of belief, but because of guilt. And then came the choir, 21 voices, all perfectly in tune, all singing the wrong song. It wasn't in the hymnal, not in the day's order, not in the church's archive, and yet they sang it as though they'd practiced it for weeks. Perfect pitch, perfect pacing, harmonies rising and falling with impossible precision. And the lyrics, "Blood on the floor by the final pew, a silver blade where none should be. The faithful gather, but only one knew, which soul would beg and never flee." The room fell, silent. The organist fainted, and Father Brown stood motionless, because he'd heard that melody before, only once, 30 years ago, at a funeral, for a man who'd died before his time, a man who'd whispered something into the priest's ear just before dying. The hymns, they're not just songs, they're warnings. The choir couldn't remember singing it, not one of them. When asked, they described feeling as though someone else had been breathing with them, pushing air through their lungs. One boy, barely 10, said something chilling. The music was already in my head. I didn't have to learn it. It learned me. The mystery began when Father Brown found the sheet music still on the organ. Not handwritten, not printed, burned. Notes and lyrics etched into the parchment as though by fire. No ink, no graphite, no physical explanation. And beneath the final measure, a name. M. Elwood. Sister Miriam Elwood. The nun who vanished. The one tied to graves with no bodies, letters from the future, bloodstained Bibles and sermons never preached. Her name had resurfaced like a wound that refused to scab. He brought the hymn to the bishop. The bishop refused to speak. He only crossed himself, whispered something in Latin, and said, "If she's writing hymns again, we're already too late." That night, Father Brown returned to the church. Alone, he opened the organ bench. Inside, stacked sheet music. Every title unfamiliar, every melody burned into the pages, but all of them shared the same haunting format. 4 stanzas, 4 days, 1 death. He counted them. 7. 7 songs, 7 days, and the hymn from that morning, dated day 1. Each page had a location. Each location was a church in the diocese. Each line hinted at a different kind of death, different victim, different sin, and one thing tied them together. Only one will know the killer, but he must sing the final hymn. Father Brown couldn't sleep. He couldn't pray, not when he discovered the second song. Hidden inside the organ's pipes, he pulled it out with trembling hands and read the title, Requiem for the Second Bell. The lyrics chilled his soul. A woman kneels with poisoned breath to mourn the child she never bore. The bells will toll a silent death, where grief has stained the chapel floor. The next morning, the second bell tower in the diocese rang at exactly 3 a.m. No one was inside. No one had access. But beneath it, in the Lady Chapel, they found a woman, dead, eyes open, mouth full of rose petals, no signs of trauma, no poison in her blood. But one detail stopped Father Brown cold. She was holding a hymnal, open to a page that didn't exist in any published edition, a page with the same lyrics he'd found in the organ pipe, burned in as though the hymnal itself had been rewritten. Live. He called the Vatican. They offered no help, only a warning. Do not sing the final hymn, not unless you wish to name him. Him? Who? Father Brown reviewed the third hymn. Hidden in the confessional beneath the floorboards, its title, Canticle for the Silent Witness. It described a boy, eyes gouged, tongue cut, still able to write the killer's name in ash. The boy was found the next day, mouth stitched, eyes closed, alive but unable to speak. In his trembling hands, ashes, and on the floor beside him, a name written in dust, smudged, illegible, but starting with a B. The suspense built into dread. Hymns weren't music anymore. They were prophecies, or curses. Father Brown understood something ancient was using sacred music to mark time, to warn, to punish, or worse, to play. By the time the fourth hymn appeared, folded into his Bible, he was no longer shocked, only sick. It read, "The priest shall read the fifth alone, for what it speaks will bleed the stone." He memorized that line, because that night the church's altar bled. No one saw who did it, but the stone was wet, smelling of iron. and across its surface, lyrics scrawled like veins. He tried to tell the choir not to sing, tried to cancel Sunday Mass, but they came anyway. They always came. And when the organist sat to play, her hands moved without her own will. They sang the fifth hymn, and the fifth death came. The baker, beloved, hung upside down in his shop, his eyes replaced with communion wafers, his tongue pinned to a cross, and in flour on the floor, written like chalk, 2 more songs, 1 more soul. The 6th hymn was never found. It found him, on the ceiling of his rectory, painted in blood. Impossible. But there, each line more terrifying than the last. The devil will hum while the angels weep, and silence will bind the choir in sleep. That night, the choir was found, all 21, lying in the pews, alive, unmoving, silent, eyes open, mouths stretched wide as if screaming something no one could hear. And from every open mouth bled ink, 1 word repeated on each tongue: finale. The 7th hymn arrived without warning, burned into the side of the altar like it had been seared there by lightning. Father Brown read it and stopped breathing, because this hymn wasn't written in rhyme or rhythm or meter. It was written like a confession, and at the bottom, in Sister Miriam's unmistakable script, he is not one of them. He is the one they all listen to, and he sings loudest when the choir is silent. The final hymn didn't name the killer. It warned who would recognize him. He wears the robe. He drinks the wine. He lifts the host. But the shadow is not his. And in the margin, carved deep, the killer is in the choir. Father Brown gathered the names, one by one, choir members, attendees, clergy. Only one wasn't accounted for, the substitute organist, a man with no record, no address, no parish history. He had shown up the day the first hymn was sung, and disappeared the night before the finale. Father Brown searched his bench, found a note, no signature, just a melody, whistled in notation. He played it, and as the final chord struck the air, the altar cracked open, inside, a mirror, and in the mirror's reflection, a second Father Brown, smiling, mouthing the words to the very first hymn, over and over. The mirror shattered, and from behind it, silence. Not peace, but the kind of silence that follows something being born. Father Brown dropped the hymnal and whispered, "I know who wrote the final song, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 12. The final clue breaks everything. The final clue wasn't found in a church, a grave, or a confession. It was buried inside Father Brown's own Bible, in handwriting that matched his, but that he never remembered writing. It was just after 3 a.m. when it happened. The storm outside had been raging for hours, lightning clawing the sky, thunder shaking the stained glass windows. The town was asleep, but St. Mary's remained lit, not by candlelight, but by something else, something colder. Father Brown sat at his desk, staring at the page that had appeared in his Bible, a page that had never been there before. It wasn't printed, it wasn't tucked in. It was part of the book now, and it didn't contain scripture. It contained a riddle. You were the first to forget, but you will be the last to remember. The one who writes the truth will also become it. And beneath that, a name, his own. Francis Brown. But in the wrong handwriting. His own hand, but twisted, angular, as though he had written it in a dream, or with a hand that wasn't quite human. The case had long seemed unsolvable, an endless spiral of clues, deaths, prophecies, shadows in the pews, and sacred things turned inside out. But this broke the pattern, because this clue didn't point outward, it pointed in. The mystery began to uncoil in the deepest part of his memory. Names returned. Events rearranged themselves. Things he'd assumed happened linearly now overlapped. A confessional booth that had whispered to him years ago now seemed to echo from the future. A hymnal that sang itself had been mentioned in a sermon he hadn't yet delivered. A killer named in ashes before the crime occurred. A mirror that showed him himself, watching from the other side. It was too much, until he opened a drawer he hadn't touched in years and found a journal, his own, or so it appeared. Inside, dated entries he'd never written, each one describing cases, confessions, and deaths that hadn't happened yet. One page chilled him most. December 3rd, 4:17 a.m. He reads the last clue, and he breaks. That was today. That was now. But who had written it, and why in his own hand? He flipped to the back of the journal. The final page. It was blank, until he blinked. And then a line appeared, written in real time. He finally understands. The mystery was never about solving them. It was about creating them. Father Brown stumbled back, his breath caught in his throat. Because in that moment, everything shattered. Every case, every clue, every corpse that whispered, every hymn that bled prophecy, every shadow in the mirror. It all pointed to one horrifying possibility. He wasn't solving these mysteries. He was writing them. Or worse, someone, something, was writing through him. He searched the church records, looked back at every case he'd solved, and noticed something monstrous. Every death had followed his presence. Every victim had met with him, or sat in his pews, or crossed paths in confession. Days before their demise, he checked the death certificates, all signed off by the coroner. But beneath that, a second signature, subtle, embedded in the ink, a watermark. F. Brown. He ran to the archives, dug deeper, found letters, wills, reports, each bearing the faint, almost invisible initials, F.B., and then an envelope, sealed, marked, only open after the 12th. Inside, a mirror shard, and a photo of him standing at the altar. But in the reflection of the polished cross behind him, he wasn't alone. Another figure stood behind him, identical, smiling, hands raised in blessing, and the parishioners in the pews, they were all him. Different versions, different ages, all staring forward, all holding Bibles, all watching. His knees buckled. The final clue. It wasn't a page, it wasn't a name, it was him. He was the clue, and he had broken. The storm outside ceased. The church fell silent. He returned to the sanctuary, altar candles extinguished, everything dark except the crucifix, glowing faintly. He approached it and saw the words engraved into the wood, words that had never been there before. You were never chosen to stop the evil. You were chosen to deliver it. Behind him, footsteps. He turned. No one, only his shadow, which didn't move when he did. The final line of his journal now appeared in his Bible, burned across the page of Revelations. There are no more clues, only consequences, and beneath it, etched with something sharp. I know who did it, but the truth will never be told. The screen cuts to black. Soft whisper. You're still watching, which means it's already begun again.